Okay, this week we're going to take a look at federalism and what it actually means and how it works in our government. Okay. Sovereignty refers to the authority to rule within one's border. People are sovereign, but we give some of our rights to the government. Under the Articles of Confederation, a union was created. States within the union maintained authority over the people. States at that time had a confederacy, and it was a governmental system in which sovereignty was vested entirely in the state, in just that states of, Virginia had their own sovereignty. It wasn't that everybody was a country at that time. So states maintained their sovereignty, and they had the ultimate authority to govern within their geographical area. And the core ingredients of this concept was what we refer to as non-interference. So whatever I was doing in my state was my business, and another state could not come in and interfere or try to tell us how to run that state. Hobbes, however, argued for sovereignty as a supreme authority. This continued to prevail as the presumption of political rule in states and throughout the globe today. Basically, limited government and civil rights for individuals. Over the centuries, new notions of sovereignty have evolved. For example, Rousseau, far different from Hobbes, saw the collective people within a state as a sovereign, ruling through their general will. In constitutional government, it is the people ruling through a body of law that is sovereign. That is the version that we most commonly see in the world today. Now, the delegates who met in Philadelphia, we know they wrote a new constitution and invented a new political form, federal government. That combined the features of confederacy with features of a unitary government. Citizens had fears that majorities with different interests and values would rule them. But however, the creation of federalism had a tendency to calm this fear. So federalism is a political system in which power is divided. It is divided and shared between the national government and the states, and this is so we can limit the power of government. Each state, as we know, has its own state constitution. However, that constitution must comply with the United States Constitution. In one sense, federalism gives Americans dual citizenship. They're citizens of the states they reside in, and they're also citizens of the United States, so they have two constitutions that they abide by. And then we also know that the 10th Amendment reserves any powers not specified by the government are reserved for the states. So when we look at the Constitution grants two categories of power to the federal government. These are known as expressed and implied. Express powers, which are found in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, and implied powers are found at the end of Section 8, grant Congress the right to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying out executions of laws. Article 6 also says that the laws of Congress shall be the supreme law of the land. We call this the Supremacy Clause. So when a federal and state law collide, the federal law will always dominate. So why is federalism important? Why do we need to know all this? Well, the national government needs to have the ability to tax and collect those taxes in order to build a strong national defense system. Second, the national government needs to regulate commerce between the states. This keeps trade wars between states from breaking out and helps to promote our economy. So there are several different types of powers in our government system or in our federal system, and you can see those listed on the slide here. We have shared, state, enumerated, denied, implied, and of course the Supremacy Clause, which we just talked about a little bit earlier. Now, our next slide will look at how are these powers distributed. So we can look here and we can see, okay, the national government is in charge of coining money and establishing the Supreme Court and declaring war. Of course, we're not going to leave those things up to the states, right? So we don't see those types of powers underneath state powers. But we do have concurrent powers, which are the shared powers, which means both the national and state have the ability to tax, to borrow money, establish how their court systems are set up. So powers are distributed, and it's kind of like a little bit of a check and balance, but we know that the national power is always going to reside. So when we look at concurrent powers, which is authority shared by the states and the national governments under the Constitution, we get a little bit closer look at what was on the previous slide, the diagram slide. And that might help visualize it a little bit more for you. And then we have state reserved powers, which once again, under the 10th Amendment, that was granted to states. And these are different things like death penalty, driving age, state taxes. How do we elect our judges to the court system? Are they voted in by the people? Are they appointed by the governor? These types of questions are all left up to the states and the people, because the people vote these different amendments in. So you're probably thinking about now, hey, wait, what about marijuana? Because memory serves me correctly, federal law states it's illegal, but there are states that have legalized it. Well, you are right. State law cannot conflict with national law, and federal law, which is national, states that it's illegal to be in possession of marijuana, as it is considered to be on the dangerous drug list. But states did vote in not only medical marijuana, but also recreational marijuana. So the federal government, in a sense, is kind of sitting back and watching all this. How is this going to play out? And in December of 2012, it was actually Patrick Leahy, who was the chairman of the Judiciary Committee. He said that one option would be to amend the Federal Controlled Substance Act in order to allow possession of up to 1 ounce of marijuana in states where it's illegal, or where it is legal, excuse me. And the Obama administration at the time came out and said that it would not challenge laws legalizing marijuana as long as those states maintain strict rules involving the sale and distribution of the drug. Went on to stress that marijuana remains illegal under federal law. So right now the federal government is just kind of watching. If it gets out of hand, they have the authority to step in and shut it down. And then here is a slide of states that have legalized marijuana. So we kind of touched on enumerated powers a little earlier, But I want to go back to that. And as I had mentioned, these are powers given to Congress, and they are listed in the Constitution. And that is, they declare war, establish post office. These are just a few of the powers. There clearly is many more, but just to start giving you an overview of what the Constitution states. And then we have what is known as implied powers of Congress. So Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18 talks about necessary, and this is the necessary and proper clause. And this kind of addresses the implied powers of Congress, which are those powers that are not explicitly mentioned or listed in the Constitution. Sometimes we hear this referred to as the elastic clause, because this is kind of taking the enumerated powers and stretching them a little bit. Some refer to them as the rubber band clause, but these are reasonably implied powers of Congress, and this is because they have been interpreted or construed in such a manner as to allow the authority of Congress to be stretched far beyond the enumerated powers. So there's several different examples, and the Louisiana Purchase is one example, because nowhere in the Constitution does it say a president can buy land, but Thomas Jefferson did that. Congress has enumerated power to coin money, so therefore it is implied that they can set minimum wage, create a Treasury Department. They're in charge of education, so they initiate the No Child Left Behind. So it's different areas such as these. Now we also have denied powers, which Article 1, Section 9 lays out powers denied to the national government. For example, we can't give preference to ports of one state over another. And then there's powers denied to the states. For example, states cannot enter into treaties, alliances, or confederations. So these are explicitly laid out in the Constitution. Now, the Supremacy Clause, which is the supreme law of the land. So if a state law conflicts with federal law shall trump state law. This is known as preemption, when a particular law is invalidated because it conflicts with or is otherwise displaced by federal law. When Congress specifically says that it intends to preempt all state laws in a field, it is express preemption, because laws of the United States government are the supreme law. It's kind of like the buck stops there. So when we look at federalism, was there any disputes that arose when it first started? Because states were accustomed to setting their own laws. So now they had a new constitution, and that brought in federalism. And so it was inevitable that disputes would arise. So what were some of these disputes? So here's 3 examples of Supreme Court cases that arose out of federalism. And they came up because states were used to, they had their own sovereignty. They made all their decisions within their borders. And now federalism comes in and says, hey, wait, no, that doesn't quite work. So they ended up in court, ended up at Supreme Court. And you can read about those through your texts, and you probably already know the basis of most of them, but they are very interesting Supreme Court cases, certainly set precedents throughout our country, and really changed the way we looked at some things. And then we have what is known as the Commerce Clause, and this is interstate and intrastate commerce. And interstate crosses state lines, and it is within the federal government's authority to regulate if it so chooses. However, intrastate commerce is conducted within a state's border, and state law applies unless, once again, there's a preemptive federal law. So this is kind of also known as what we refer to as dual federalism, and that's the state and the federal government working separately in their own entities. So dual federalism, you may have heard this referred to as the layer cake federalism, is a separation of state and national government, which basically means you do your thing and I will do mine. It's a view that holds that the Constitution is a compact among sovereign states so that the powers of the national government and the states are clearly defined. Each government unit, national and state, is sovereign within its spheres. So the relationship between nations and states is sometimes best characterized by tension as opposed to cooperation. Now, dual federalism, of course, still exists on some level, but more often than not today we see cooperative federalism. And cooperative federalism, as I said, is taking the place of dual federalism. It is more likened to that of a marble cake. You see how it kind of swirls, so everybody's working together. So, for example, if you looked at Social Security Act, that is set up by the national government. It's done by the national government. All rules are done by Congress. And regardless of where you live, all rules are the same. Now let's look at Medicaid, which came about, in the 1960s. Now this is a national program, but it's administered by the states and it's partially funded by the states, meaning that they have the flexibility in how they want to administer the program. So they're working with the federal government and they also have their own rights. This has a lot of elements of what we call de-evolution, which is the passing down of authority from the national government to states and localities. And then on this slide, you can kind of see a side-by-side comparison of dual and cooperative, or the layer cake and the marble cake. So that wraps up this lecture. If you have any questions, let me know, and good luck on this week's assignments. Thanks.